I'm just going to start out making a drawing here. I'm not measuring a halfway mark. You can if you want to. I'm just eyeballing it. So that halfway vertically and horizontally just helps me get an idea of where things are going to land. So like I said, that horizon line is just a little bit below, maybe a centimeter below the center line moving horizontally. So somewhere right around here. I know it's hard to see on my paper. And the head of the figure is in the top right quadrant here. So to the right and slightly above center. That shadow shape down here at that area, that I call that the pit of the neck. Oh, whoops, I'm looking at the wrong line here. This is why we do a drawing first. But that shadow shape under his chin, between the collarbones there at the top of the rib cage, that shadow shape goes just below that halfway mark. And I'm not going to draw out every detail on there. I just want to have a good idea of where all these things are going to land. The figure's kind of leaning towards the right. And then his left shoulder, the shoulder on our right, is right in the top of the deltoid right there, is right along that halfway mark. So not the horizon line, but the halfway mark. Moving across the page in this direction. The head is tilted just a little bit with the, if the brow is sitting a little bit below the top of the ear, that tells us that the head is tilted forward. So the ear is a great landmark for that reason. This flag over here is just a little bit above the top of the head. So that red flag is also a good landmark for that. So the way he's holding out his arm here, another thing to guide you along in the drawing phase here is looking at the negative space between his forearm and the side of his rib cage right here. That negative space tells us a lot about the outer contour of the figure and how all these landmarks are going to line up with each other. There's a lot of subtle motion in the figure, a lot of things leaning and drifting in different directions. He's not totally static here. Even the way he's interacting with the water, it's not an even line. It's kind of sloping downward this way towards this hand submerged in the water. So again, using this center line as a guide, not the horizon, but this center line going from left to right. The top of these sails over here just barely hit the top of it. Another thing to look at is how these shoulders are tilted and open up a little bit. So if we look at this deltoid over here, lining that up with the top of this one, his right shoulder or the shoulder on our left is just a little bit higher than this one. So don't underestimate the challenges of someone in a really subtle pose like this. What seems like might be static and resting and at peace might have a lot of very subtle relationships. This shoulder is a little bit higher than this one. think I made the figure just as a whole way too big. That's okay. It is important when we're doing a master copy to get the composition as close as we can to the original. We don't want to, we're not here to teach Winslow Homer a lesson about composition and about how we can make his painting better. So we don't want to crop anything. We don't want to change it around too much. That can be a different project that you do outside of this class. I think when we do a master copy, we want to learn from it. So we're going to learn from it by really just, what's the word? Surrendering whatever impulse we might have compositionally. Let's just stick with what's there and we'll get the most out of it that way. And then we can do what we want with our own work. Okay. Zoom back out again. So a landscape like this, we want to work back to front. There's a lot of space in this painting, so we want to start far away and work our way forward. At least for the first few marks, we will spend some time, most of our time on this figure, I assume. But I'm going to start off with this gray that we see behind the figure. Can I get any recommendations on how to make gray? Anyone want to take a guess? You could use Payne's gray. That's the short answer. I don't have Payne's gray though. I'm mixing ultramarine with burnt sienna, mixing blue and brown to get a nice even gray. So not too warm, not too cool. If anything, maybe it's a little bit on the cooler side, but maybe I'm seeing that just in the context of the really warm skin tone. Maybe it's both. So a couple things I want to avoid here. There's a white flag beneath this red flag over here. I guess I should avoid those flags just in general. I'm going to erase my line for that halfway mark. And I also want to preserve these white sails over here. If you'd like to use masking fluid, you can. There's also highlights within the figure there that we want. I wouldn't go into the figure at all with the gray. So gray is just as gonna desaturate everything that gets laid on top of it. So I'm not gonna go into the figure with this gray. Sometimes, depending on with what's going on in the painting, you can take what's happening in the sky and just kind of go right through what's happening in the foreground. In this case, I think that's gonna hurt these skin tones. Maybe they won't, but I'm gonna assume that they will, just to be safe. I'm gonna start off with that first mark. You can see like I don't have enough room up here because I made the figure too big. But I love what he did with the sky, the shapes of the clouds, how it echoes what the figure is doing, or maybe the figure is echoing what the sky is doing. It's hard to really say, but it's all very purposeful. Using a larger flat brush for this. This edge gets a little bit soft here, so I'm going to add some clean water. A good lesson in positive and negative space too, looking at this negative shape right here. And this gray that I mixed, it looks kind of like the blue and the brown as they settle down on my palette, they separate a little bit. So I'm gonna keep mixing them together.
I noticed the exact same thing and I thought I was going crazy.
Yeah, I just noticed that too. You can see it happening a little bit in the sky, but not too much. But as long as we keep it mixed up in our palette, I think we'll be okay. I kind of like what's happening with it in the sky. It's kind of beautiful, but as long as we don't let it go too far, we don't want it to be distracting. Whoops, just knocked that one. Probably could have used some masking fluid for these tiny little flags, but I'm just gonna go for it. Last night, the 2-year-old said, I don't know, I don't remember what we were doing, but he was like, just go for it. I was like, who said that to you? I just realized now it's probably me. I'm mixing up a little bit more pigment here. I kind of ran out right before the end. I don't want to get too dark. I want to match this rest of the sky, but especially up against the figure, I want this to be consistent.
Shane, sorry, I have a backwards question. The total this we're doing this for 9 by 12?
Yes.
Okay.
The painting
And
itself is proportional to about 9 by 8 1/4.
oh,
So
okay. Okay.
maybe that's why my figure came out too big.
Yeah, I'm having a little trouble. That's why I'm asking. Okay. And then, I can't really see when you draw on, it's very light, you know. I
Yeah.
hope on the recording it's a little bit better, but, I'm just curious about when you divided it horizontally and vertically. There's such a big deal about the rule of thirds that, you know, and you never use the horizon, you know, near the middle of the painting and all that sort of stuff. And then, but as you said, we're not challenging the composition, and it's absolutely gorgeous. So,
Yeah. Let's
w-
look here. I'll line
yeah,
that up right now.
thank you. Yeah, and I'm curious about when things changed. If you can, if we can talk about that at some point.
What do you with what changed?
Well, the rule of thirds is such a big deal now, you know.
Right. I mean, it's always been here. Let's look. I'm going to share my
Okay.
screen.
All right,
That's a
thanks.
really good question. I don't think it necessarily changed, and I don't think it's too harsh of a rule. We could think about, so maybe the top of his head is right at that 1/3.
Uh-huh.
Maybe that's about it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
It,
and then well, I've been reading a lot, also very inspired by all of this. But reading about what, and that had to do with one of the other paintings. So I'll tell you the question, but then let's hold it. When you have something like the huge palm tree with the very little boy, um, and
yes.
so when there's a figure in the painting, it usually is the center of interest. And yet he violates so many rules as I've heard them, you know.
Right. I mean, yeah,
When,
not necessarily. And that's why I
yeah.
think there's something like kind of under the radar but modern about his work,
Hmm.
which I think is cool. I
Yep.
think that you don't have to have, not every figure has to be the center of attention in a painting.
Right. Right.
So sometimes there's diagonals that line up
Hmm.
with the corners. Sometimes there's like elements kind of riding along those lines. And so when you
Interesting.
draw those diagonals like this,
Yep.
the thirds should line up with each of those too.
Hmm.
The word like where they intersect. But
Okay.
yeah, even with all of that, I still it seems to be just kind of I kind of like what's happening off the center lines, where this is like 4.25,
Okay.
maybe halfway, somewhere around here. Yeah, I don't have a good answer.
Mm. No, but thank you so much for reviewing that. That
Yeah,
really,
no, I think it's a great thing to bring up.
and now I have 42 lines on my sketchbook, on my sketchpad.
Okay, good. Yeah, yeah.
I'll erase a few. Thank you.
Yeah, be careful overloading with the lines. Yeah.
Yeah.
My take is, if I could weigh in, the thirds is great for diagnosing or setting up a composition if you're starting out. That splitting, I did the same thing. I did my drawing before the class, dividing with the center line um, helps you with a skull or with any kind of composition. If you're drawing something, if you're copying something, if you're
Right.
drawing from or an image, but if you're designing something, a photograph, you know, you're trying to compose a photograph or you're trying to compose a painting from scratch, that third rule really comes into play in making a great, well-designed composition. That's kind of the way I look at it.
I always draw or paint first and then look at that stuff after if I need it.
Ah, interesting.
Like all my paintings here in my studio, I kind of just start out with just putting the shape where I think it needs to go
Hmm.
intuitively. If
Wow.
that goes wrong, I'll start asking questions.
Oh, interesting. Okay. That's years of training just went away. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And I think with any of these old masters too, it's like I think if we ask them, they would be like, Yeah, those are helpful, like unless they're not, unless you
Yeah,
just feel
yeah.
like doing something different. So
All right.
yeah, I don't have a
Yeah,
great answer.
great photographers will do the same thing. They'll teach the rule of thirds, but then they'll like 20% of their works are exceptions, and you just have to.
Yeah,
That's where experience comes in, I think.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yep. I'm using cerulean and ultramarine up here. Just wet into dry. Even the brush itself is a little bit dry to get some of this texture up here. I think if you look at some of the Italian Renaissance painters, definitely Leonardo, Michelangelo, those types, they are like the way they're putting those compositions together is very almost kind of mathematical. So they're taking some of that really seriously. But someone like, I don't know, Morandi, who I really like, Wayne Thiebaud, even Van Gogh is probably the like I don't think Van Gogh was measuring too much. It's just kind of like the tree goes there because it has to.
Yeah, right, right. Very interesting. Okay.
I'm curious where Winslow Homer lands on that spectrum though.
Hmm. Well,
Yeah, I pay attention to the center line and being just kind of off balance. Let me look at one more here, just while we're on the subject.
yeah.
Let the sky dry a little bit.
Yeah, I love how that's just a little bit off. I really love that. But then he's my favorite too. So there you go.
Let me see. I always come back to Rembrandt self-portraits. Let me share my screen.
Huh.
And there's something about I think some of these are some of the best paintings in the world ever. I think you can go find one at the Norton Simon. Might be this one. But I always look to this. So let's see. Okay, so if this is 10 inches wide, this is halfway. So I feel like there's some tension in putting like so this area of the face is like the main focal point of the painting. When we look at someone, we look into their eyes, usually just one eye at a time. So when we're painting people, a good painter like this will focus more on one eye than the other. It's clear that this eye is the way his head is tilted, this eye is a little bit closer to us than this eye. You can see the light in the pupil in this eye, but not on this one. That's all by design. But having that brow bone just off center, I think creates a lot of tension in this composition. Because if he cropped it, let's see if he's in the center. This feels a little different. And then let's look at the thirds. Somewhere around there. How tall is this? Let me see. 12.7. I'm not good at math. Somewhere around there, I want to say. The thirds don't, I guess the head is kind of lined up along that third there, but the way it goes right through the nose makes me think he wasn't really looking at the thirds too closely. I don't think this tells us anything. I think this, the center line right through right next to where the bridge of the nose meets that brow bone. I remember I talked a lot about that when we were painting the skull too, as being like that's probably the most important area of a portrait. That to me seems really purposeful. And I've noticed that with Rembrandt. So for this skin tone, so I'm going to map out the shadow shapes first, just like we've been doing. Use a smaller brush. Let's see, I want to say burnt sienna is a good place to start. Maybe we'll just start with just straight up burnt sienna. Let me see if I mix in a little bit raw umber to darken it. I wonder if he had burnt umber, he might be using that. I don't have burnt umber on my palette. Maybe I should get it. I'm going to add a little bit of alizarin crimson and a little bit of ultramarine blue to darken this a tiny bit, but it's mostly going to be made up of burnt sienna. So if it's looking too purple, add more burnt sienna.
Can you repeat it? It's burnt sienna and what were you saying?
I put in a little bit of alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue to darken it a tiny bit, but we don't want to put too much
Thanks.
and turn it too purple. Dark brown is what we're after. And we want to be aware of the light hitting that bottom lip and hitting the brow. So I know I can come back and push that shadow further. So I'm going to just grab some water here and just wet into wet. I'm just going to pull this pigment around, looking at the shadow shapes in the eye sockets across the brow here. So remember with our skull, how we connected those with the bridge of the nose. Same thing's happening on this figure here. Even though it's smaller and we're further away. And what I just mentioned about Rembrandt too, even. That's an area we want to be sure we get that right. But other than that, just preserve those light shapes. So off to the side here, I'm actually going to clean my brush and grab just burnt sienna on its own for this shadow at the side plane of the head, which is brighter and more saturated, or we could say brighter and warmer than this cast shadow on his neck into the collarbones there. And even for the hair shape, I'm going to continue this brown up into there just to unify the whole figure. And I know I can go back in later and darken that and cool it down. So just like we did with the skull, we want the head as a whole to have roundness before we worry too much about individual features like the eyes or the nose or anything like that. We want the whole head to feel round. So I'm going to take some more water. Add the tiniest bit of alizarin crimson. There's a little highlight on the front facing plane of that nose too, covering up those shapes that I just made. I'm anticipating going over this again with some darker darks. And so as I get brighter, as I get, whoops, I just splashed water everywhere. As I get more towards that, think of the light hitting the head as kind of passing through the part of the head that's closest to us and facing up, which would be the front of the brow right here in the forehead, the tip of the nose, and then this bottom lip right there. So everything, again, I'm thinking about like the roundness of the whole entire head before I go in and carve out those smaller, darker shadow shapes that really define the features. So I've got more burnt sienna and a little bit of alizarin crimson. I'm gonna grab a bigger brush. And I'm gonna do the same thing for the torso now. So if we think of the center of the rib cage right here, near the sternum, we want to be aware of those light shapes. But just like we did with the head, think about like the overall roundness of everything. And we're going to go back to what we talked about with value and temperature. So it's brighter here, brighter and warmer. This gets darker and cooler as we move away from that. So I'm starting out with this burnt sienna, alizarin crimson with lots of water. Starting out with the shadow shapes just to get a feel for everything. Even if they get covered up later, again, I'm anticipating coming back and pushing those. So some of those variations between warm and cool that I'm seeing here looks like those cooler shapes were added in a second layer. So I'm mostly focusing on value and edge right now. So for this deltoid right here, think about that roundness being created by the shadow, form shadow on the left side of the muscle, and then getting brighter as it turns towards the right. Looks like that blue he used for the water passed right over this submerged hand. Maybe while this dries, we can get after those trees over there on the right. So I'm going to clean off my palette right here for these green trees. Totally different color, totally different temperature. So I don't want it to all mix up. And get a gray mess. Just keep that in mind anytime you're going from a really warm thing to a really cool thing or light to dark. Those colors are mixing on your palette. It's going to make everything harder. Seems like a really cool green. So I'm going to use some Viridian to start. I'm gonna add some ultramarine. Maybe that's too cool, so I'll add a little bit of yellow ochre. I don't have sap green, maybe that would be better. So I'll let that dry before I get into that little building behind there, so those don't get too mixed up. Might be good to go in and paint, or at least start painting the water. So it looks like a mix of cerulean and ultramarine in different amounts for different areas of the water here. I'll start out with just cerulean on its own and just map out where we're at here. It looks like he used a couple different layers and dropped in a little bit of red into some of these areas too. Remember, when you're painting water, I mean, when you're painting anything, but especially water, the way you move the brush the way your hand is acting, holding the brush, dragging the paint around, you want it to sort of act like the way that water moves. We want the paint to look like the thing that it's representing, but we also want it to act like it, if that makes sense. That's where that gesture drawing can come in handy. This darker blue on the horizon back here seems like more of a ultramarine, but I'm just gonna block this in for now as a placeholder. A little bit of a highlight on this figure over here. Use a different brush for this. I'm going to put the flat brush down. I'm going to use this larger round brush for all this stuff happening in here. Since this brush tip is like probably the most dynamic, I'll get the best, or not the best, the most diverse kinds of brush strokes that I can get. I'm going to start off with just the cerulean again. Maybe I'll add some pink in while it's still wet once I have these brush strokes down. But at each brushstroke that I'm looking at, so this one that passes kind of right under the torso and through that hand, I want to think about how that brushstroke begins and ends. How did Winslow Homer make that brushstroke? Like with what amount of pigment and water, but also with how much pressure, how much sharpness at one end and softness at another end. Looks like I just messed up that one spot right there. Maybe I just made the same mistake that Winslow Homer did, and I'll have to like grind out some of that paper later. Maybe that's how he got that texture. But whatever brushstroke you're making, you want your brush to be doing what it was made to do, using the whole brush tip. Looks like lots of water over here. Water on the page, I mean. Oh, there's lots of water in this painting too, but a little bit more washy on the sides here, a little bit more crisp and clean cut in the center, which helps bring our focus towards the figure. So probably not an accident. And we're not going to get it perfect. Don't drive yourself crazy trying to get every single brushstroke absolutely perfect, but I don't want you to overthink it, but don't underthink it either. We want to get the most out of this painting for the most selfish reasons, right? We want to get better at painting. We want our paintings to be better. So it's not just a tribute to Winslow Homer. Like we're doing this for us. So we might revisit painting water on its own this semester. But one thing that I've found, and this goes for painting anything, it could be people or objects or landscapes, but with water especially, it's one thing to paint what it looks like, but you also want to paint what it's doing. And that goes back to each brushstroke that you're making, telling the story of how that line or shape is acting in relation to the other lines and shapes around it. Even though it's a representational painting, that's sort of an abstract idea. Whoops. So you got really dark and opaque down here. That might be a little too dark. So I wonder what red he's using back here. Looks like he had cad red on his palette from that flag. So let's assume that's the red he dropped into the water to mix up with that cerulean, giving us kind of this gray. You know what? Let's hold off on that because I think the cerulean blue dried and then the red went on top of that. I think that's what's happening here. So yeah, let's hold off on that. My mistake. One thing we can do in the meantime, push that darker horizon in the back a little darker. That's going to be ultramarine blue, I think. I'm going to use CAD red. Put in this red flag over here. Not really getting these shapes absolutely perfect, but they're like small graphic little red shapes, so their function in the painting is still there. A little bit of yellow and blue. Now that we know he had CAD yellow, okay. I'm gonna step out for just a minute and let this dry a little bit. I know we didn't do a long break today. It's more of a 2 short breaks kind of a day. Let me just step out for 2 or 3 minutes here. I'll leave this up though and let this all dry a bit. And then I want to go back into the figure before we're done. Okay, so I want to go back into this figure. This might take 2 passes, so I'm gonna. It's tricky. The things we kind of have to go in reverse. The things we see on the surface, like those really defined shadow shapes on the face, those really clear-cut lines across the shoulder and the torso, those will be last. So we want to do, I'm going to do another round of just developing the form beneath that. I think if you have burnt umber, you should use it. I'm kicking myself for not having it here. I have burnt sienna, and I'm mixing that with some ultramarine blue and a little bit of alizarin crimson to make a less saturated and darker brown. Burnt sienna is very like orange and sort of like rusty brown. Burnt umber is darker and less saturated. So I'm using that ultramarine and the alizarin to kind of fake it a little bit. Here's this shadow across the side plane of the head up here. Paying attention to the shape of the brushstrokes. Actually, a really good exercise for simplifying a portrait, because this is small enough that we can't really worry about a lot of the subtle, delicate, complicated features of the face. Winslow Homer has done a great job of breaking those down into simple planes. It would actually be a great exercise to blow up this face and do a larger study of it just for those simple planes, if that's something you're interested in. Breaking your head down into those simple planes can be really challenging. Because when we look at a face, it's an overwhelming amount of information. There's so much to see. It's harder to know what not to paint. So again, I'm still anticipating coming back into this to carve out those stronger shapes. I'm going to do ultramarine, alizarin crimson, and burnt umber again, but in much different ratios. If you look at my palette over here, way more ultramarine blue this time to get that dark black of the hair shape. Almost looks like a swim cap. So the way it curves away from the ear towards the forehead really just this describes that side plane of the head, giving it a lot of dimension. So don't underestimate this tiny little curve right there. So now if I push, going down into this shadow down here, also super dark, but more on the warmer side. So I'll do the same mixture, but in this one, I'll instead of pushing the blue, I'm going to push the brown. It still has blue in it, but I'm leaning it more towards the warmer side, even though they're both really dark. Maybe this is too dark, actually. But as we navigate our way through the figure, think about that value versus temperature. We're going to be getting darker, but think about the kind of edge that it has and how you can lean one color towards blue or towards brown. See right here, defining that side plane of the bicep, it turns a little bit towards blue. Not blue itself on its own, but I'm saying towards blue. Another way to say it would just be cooler. I hope that makes sense. But again, keep in mind all these shadows that we're working on right here, uh, nowhere near as dark as that hair shape up there that we did earlier. Maybe a little bit here in that armpit or that cast shadow on the inside of the elbow right here, but all of this is like a lighter and more rich brown color. So if you look on my palette, I just have, it's the same, not the same, it's a similar shadow, similar color, I mean, for this shadow, but dividing it up into one warmer, one cooler, and then within both of those, I can have more water on the left side, more pigment on the right side. That's going to determine the value. So by looking at it in that way, I can find my way through here thinking about value and temperature, staying aware of my edges. And just remember when you switch from one to the other, make sure you're cleaning your brush. It's one thing if they blend on the paper and that's on purpose. But if you're mixing the two together unintentionally, you're going to get more of a mess. It's like the tiniest bit of cad red in here. Really saturated top edge of this shoulder into the collarbone. Maybe it was some kind of a red pencil underneath. Could be that.
I'm really blowing up the image and it really looks like I think you're right. There might be some pencil, especially like around his hand. You blow up, you can see some
Here.
kind of blue crayon or something.
It looks like he used the cerulean of from the water to like carve out this plane of the base of the thumb right here. And cerulean's pretty opaque. So he may have done that later. And then yeah, this like red part of the thumb down here. Yeah, it's this is where it gets tricky to know what what order he did these things in, and where he may have gone back and tweaked some things later. So burnt sienna and alizarin crimson are how I'm getting this really rich but dark saturated brown right there. And then these cooler passages just have more blue in them, more ultramarine blue. All right, just like that, the time is getting away from me, so I do want to go back into the portrait here. I'm just taking some clean water, smoothing out some of these transitions on the torso that got a little blotchy. Let me stick this in the sun really quickly. So just to review before we're done here today, our homework is to do your research, choose an artist, tell us a little bit about what you like and why about that painter, and share that on the discussion board, and then do a master copy of one of their paintings. I'd like it to be a watercolor painter. I think you'll get the most out of it by doing that. Just like we did today, we can think about what pigments they used and the order that they made certain brushstrokes. If you're really set on doing a different kind of painter, that's okay too. I want you to care about it more than anything. Like I want you to care about it. That care is gonna drive you through the project. So, and as long as they're a master painter, they can be more contemporary if they're still making work today. Just pick something that you think is really good and something that you want to learn from and get something out of. Okay, I'm gonna go check on my painting. Yeah.
Shane,
Yes.
I was wondering what that object was on the left side of the painting near the horizon, so I blew it up, but it's so subtle. It's the back of the head of another swimmer with just
Yes.
the shoulder.
I forgot about that. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Really cool.
if you look at it, you just the barest shape, but once you see it, what it is, you can't stop seeing it.
Yeah.
It's amazing how few strokes.
Yeah, and I love thinking like what would this painting be without that then too? Like even though we don't see it, just because it's not taking up our attention, it could still be an important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, it gives it context. These are
Yeah.
guys out swim. They're they're fishing or swimming or something.
Yep, it's a orchestration of shapes. So I should put that in there maybe right after I do this. So while these shadows are brown, it looks as if they have some purple in them. And I think that's going to be helped by the ultramarine with the alizarin crimson moving through the burnt sienna. So be aware of how you're balancing those three pigments. That's how you're going to get these dark and warm shadows with some variations in the temperature. So now when we push these darker shadows, sorry, it's so blurry. I don't know why the camera is like that. I wonder if I can zoom in on here. Let me see. There we go. That's better. Forgot I can do that. Now that we're pushing these shadows darker, after we built up those underlying forms, it has a lot more dimension than if we just went for it on the first pass with these really dark shapes. I assume that's how he went about it. We can't know for sure. And now I'll just do the same on the rest of the figure. You can really see the roundness in that rib cage there. It's a similar mark over here, just a bigger brush stroke. So I'm getting a slightly bigger brush. I don't want to fake it with the smaller brush. Still wanted to revisit that hand over there. I'm going a little over our class time today. But I think he used the cerulean from the water and mixed that with the skin tone a little bit.
You're painting off camera.
Oh, thank you. I think I underestimated the length of the hand a little bit. Because when I put that thumb in earlier, that thumb is really more down here. So this is just straight cerulean. It just looked like he followed that pencil line with the cerulean. I think I kind of botched the hand. It's okay. Kind of a complicated thing to rush at the end, I guess. So I could always, maybe I'll cover it up with water, painted water later. Maybe I can add this figure over here. I love that simple shape of the silhouette back there. Just like a little island of a person. And I'll try and get in this building over here. One last thing that I think is really important in this composition are these dark shapes in the foreground. So if you have more time, you can develop these in less of a rush than I am right now. grab a little bit of that cad red from earlier and water that down and just add that in to the water over here. This sandy beach back here, I'm just going to use some yellow ochre and raw umber. All right, now I should walk away. I'm just going to start making this worse.